I've decided to write everything from my perspective, not to seek sympathy, not to defend myself, but because I need to put words to the chaos. My name is Liam, I'm 29 years old, and until just a month ago, I thought I was in a stable marriage with a wonderful woman, Jenny. Now my reality is entirely different. I got a text message that changed everything. My beautiful, wonderful wife was having an affair. And it was calculated and very, very ugly. Jenny and I met back in college. She was the bright, bubbly girl whose energy was contagious to everyone around her. I was studying architecture, while she was initially pursuing something completely different, though she switched majors several times. I felt like I'd found the right person. After college, I was fortunate enough to start as a project engineer at an architecture firm. I worked my way up and, after a few years, became a project manager for several exciting projects. At the same time, Jenny trained to become a flight attendant. She was drawn to the idea of traveling, meeting new people, and experiencing different parts of the world. Her personality was a perfect fit for the job. We got engaged and, for years after graduating, we got married. I felt secure and proud. I had built a stable life for us, and things seemed to move along without much drama. At least, that's what I thought. I never realized that Jenny's need for excitement and attention might have been greater than I understood. Outwardly, she's warm, social, and cheerful. But in hindsight, I now see that she often craved intense thrills, a constant need for validation. A few years ago, Jenny excitedly told me she was flying with a captain named Brian. She mentioned him in passing as a friendly, charismatic pilot who was easy to talk to. It's not unusual for colleagues in the aviation industry to socialize, especially on long flights where they spend a lot of time together. Occasionally, she'd mention their conversations and was open about how well they got along. I didn't think much of it. I remember thinking it was nice that she had good rapport with her coworkers. But I would later learn that their relationship wasn't just professional. Looking back now, I remember little details that should have raised red flags much earlier. Short, intense text messages she received late at night, the smiles she gave when looking at her phone, or how she sometimes seemed a bit distracted when we talked about the future. At the time, I brushed it off as stress or fatigue. In hindsight, I see now that she was probably planning her next meeting with Brian or waiting for a text from him. Everything was hidden behind her cheerful exterior, and I let myself be fooled because I wanted to trust my own wife. After about a year of knowing Brian, Jenny began talking about him more often and even suggested I should meet him. I didn't quite understand why it was so important for me to meet this particular pilot, but she was insistent. You'd like him, he's into architecture and sports, just like you. I was surprised by her enthusiasm but figured it was her way of saying, I want you to know him so I don't have to split my time between my friend and my marriage. I was naive. What I didn't realize was that she and Brian probably found it thrilling to introduce him to me while secretly carrying on their affair. One evening, Brian came to our house for the first time. Jenny had prepared dinner, and we sat in the living room chatting. I learned that Brian was married to a woman named Claire. He mentioned that Claire worked as an IT consultant and that their schedules often overlapped, which suited his life as a pilot. He was charismatic, easygoing, and asked me a lot of questions. I actually felt quite relaxed in his company. I had no reason to suspect anything, so we talked about my latest project at work, design concepts, and sports results. Everything felt pleasant. I was even glad Jenny had found a colleague she got along with so well. You might wonder how I could be so blind, but honestly, there was nothing in his demeanor that hinted at an ongoing love affair with my wife. That's the thing about skilled liars, they know how to play their part. Meanwhile, Jenny acted just as usual, playful, maybe a little flirtatious, but that was often her way with friends. At least, that's what I thought. I had no idea the stolen glances, smiles, and whispers they exchanged were more than just friendly chemistry. Over time, Brian became a more frequent guest in our home. Since he and Jenny worked together, he would often drop by on his way home or happen to be in the area. Looking back, it's clear they made sure he was around often enough for it to feel natural. It sickens me now to think of how they could sit across from me at our dining table, discussing weekend plans or flight routes, all while secretly planning their next rendezvous. They would exchange glances or whisper to each other when I left the room or took out the trash. I thought I was someone with decent observational skills. As a project manager, I always had to keep track of details and potential risks. But here, I was blind. Had I been suspicious? I felt a vague sense of unease sometimes, especially when Jenny was at work and wasn't as communicative as she used to be. But I always justified her behavior. She's busy, she's probably tired, she just wants to rest when she gets home. My trust in her was so strong that I couldn't even imagine her being unfaithful. Everything changed a few weeks ago when I received an anonymous text message. It read, "I work with Jenny. I've seen her having an affair with the pilot, Brian. I'm sorry to bring this to you, but you deserve to know." My heart sank. I stared at the screen, feeling a strange mix of panic and disbelief. Should I confront Jenny immediately? I almost did, but something told me to gather more information first. I didn't want to come across as jealous or paranoid without proof. So I kept the text to myself. Instead, I started observing more carefully. I checked her computer when she wasn't home, looking for any clues. I searched her emails but found nothing obvious. No saved pictures, no suspiciously named files. I almost felt frustrated with myself for snooping. But the text message kept gnawing at me. After a few days with no success, I decided to take a step I never thought I'd take. I installed a small voice recorder in her car. It felt wrong and invasive, but I needed the truth. I bought a simple digital recorder that could be hidden in one of the gaps near the front seat. I hoped she and Brian might talk in the car at some point. People often speak more freely while driving, I thought. Meanwhile, I continued looking for other clues. I noticed that Jenny often woke up earlier than me to reply to text messages. I started keeping an eye on her phone. I saw that she sometimes put it on Do Not Disturb mode and quickly put it away if I entered the room. My trust in her was crumbling. After a few days, I retrieved the recorder. I listened to the file with headphones. The audio quality wasn't great, but I could clearly hear Jenny's voice. She was talking to a man, and what I heard made my blood run cold. She laughed flirtatiously, mentioned Brian's name, and talked about how exciting it was last time. She said something about Liam doesn't suspect a thing, and it's almost too easy to fool him. Their conversation was full of innuendos and references to past moments they'd shared. It was clear they were having a sexual relationship, and they seemed to relish the fact that I was clueless. I could hardly breathe as I listened. The text message wasn't some malicious prank. It was the truth, and Jenny had been cheating on me. I felt a mix of sorrow, anger, and disbelief, as if my entire world was falling apart. Still, I hadn't seen concrete evidence like explicit photos or messages. Until one night, when she was asleep, I realized I could unlock her phone using her fingerprint. The thought felt insane, but in my desperation, I went into the bedroom, lifted her hand, and placed her finger on the sensor. The phone unlocked. What I found on her phone was far worse than I ever could have imagined. I scrolled through their text messages and saw how they flirted, sent photos, mocked me and Brian's wife, Claire. They called us boring, uninteresting, and laughed about how we didn't notice anything. Sometimes they joked about how Brian tricked Claire into thinking he was working overtime. Other times, Jenny made disparaging comments about me, about how easy it was to distract me, how she could manipulate me into not asking questions. I saw pictures of Jenny and Brian together in various situations, some sexual, some just selfies in hotel rooms. I was in a trance as I went through it all, feeling physically sick. I found one photo taken in our own home. It showed Jenny kneeling in front of Brian, wearing the same dress and necklace she'd worn the last time we had dinner together. She had slept with him while I was home. I had to rush to the bathroom to splash water on my face. Now I had the proof. Proof that she had deliberately and over a long period of time deceived me. It seemed like she even got a thrill out of leading this double life. Like a game, a forbidden game that excited her to have sex with Brian while letting me meet him at home. A part of me died when I saw how she ridiculed me in front of him. I thought she loved me, or at least respected me. But from their conversations, it seemed like she saw me as a convenient part of her comfortable everyday life, while Brian was the excitement she craved. I powered down her phone, put it back where she'd left it, and went to the bathroom. I remember sitting on the toilet lid, shaking. I cried, but I was also so full of anger that I didn't know what to do. Confronting her at 3 in the morning felt pointless. I needed a plan. I needed to figure out how I wanted to handle this. Part of me was ready to end everything. Another part hoped there was an explanation. But when I thought about how they spoke disparagingly about me, it was hard to see any way back. The next day at work, I was in shock. I could barely focus on my tasks, but I tried. I felt I needed to control my reaction so I wouldn't act impulsively. I reached out to my best friend, someone I trust more than anyone else, and asked for advice. I gave him a broad overview of what had happened, not all the details, but enough for him to understand that Jenny had been unfaithful. He listened in shock, got angry on my behalf, and suggested I speak with a lawyer to understand my options. Maybe a divorce was inevitable. I spent the following days delving deeper into our shared financial obligations and mentally preparing myself to leave her. Perhaps I should have confronted her in the moment, but I felt I needed to be strategic. I didn't want to be manipulated or drawn into a reconciliation scene I would later regret. My trust in her was shattered, and I knew I could never trust her again. I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer and discussed what would happen if we divorced. We reviewed bank accounts, the house, and potential legal processes. The lawyer was thorough and professional. Inside, I felt completely broken. Jenny was about to leave on a 3-day work trip. I saw this as my chance to handle things in peace. Before she left, she kissed me on the cheek as usual and asked if I could water the plants and check the mail. Completely ordinary things. I played along, giving her a perfunctory peck on the cheek. Inside, I was screaming at myself to stay composed. Once she was gone, I began quietly removing myself from our shared life, at least mentally. I contacted the banks, separated our shared accounts, and changed some passwords. I made a list of everything I needed to do before I left her. During this time, I went through her and Brian's messages multiple times. I hated myself for being so obsessed with the details. But it was as if I needed to see the evidence again and again to accept it as real. I found a video that made me want to vomit. They had filmed themselves in our own home during a dinner I had been present at. Apparently, they had snuck off to the guest room for a brief moment while I thought Jenny was taking out the trash and Brian had gone to help. I remembered that exact dinner. It was a night I served grilled food and talked about an upcoming architecture conference. The thought of them sneaking away for a quickie while I remained clueless is utterly disgusting. That's when I decided on my own silent ending. I printed a still from the video, an image that unmistakably showed Jenny and Brian in an intimate situation. I had thought about writing a letter, but I realized the picture said everything. I also left my wedding ring next to it and placed both on the kitchen counter. There was no way she could miss it when she got home. At the same time, I packed up the most important of my belongings and arranged for temporary housing. I contacted my friend again, telling him I was finally ready to leave. When I closed the front door behind me for the last time as a resident of that house, it felt surreal. I looked at our wedding photos hanging in the hallway and felt nothing but contempt for all the lies. I took some personal items I didn't want to leave behind, but much of the furniture I left as it was. I didn't want reminders of that life anymore. I figured she could keep it all if it meant anything to her. There was an emptiness inside me, but also a strange relief. The decision was made, and I no longer had to pretend to be unaware. That she would come home to an empty house, find the photo and the ring, was part of my revenge. I was so hurt and angry that I could no longer bring myself to be the nice guy. It was a direct confrontation without me having to be there. I wanted her to understand that I knew everything. I suppose I also wanted to hurt her emotionally, to let her see the depths of disappointment she had thrown me into. I turned off my phone when I left. I wasn't ready to hear her calls or her excuses. That night, I stayed at my best friend's place. Early the next morning, my phone started ringing incessantly, with a barrage of texts pouring in. Jenny wrote desperately, "Please call me. What's going on? Later, we can fix this, I love you." Even some mutual friends reached out with questions like, "What the hell happened?" One wrote that Jenny was devastated, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I was completely shattered myself. I continued to ignore all attempts at contact. I felt numb. My only focus was on practical matters, a lawyer, housing, trying to keep my job. At that point, I took a difficult but necessary step. I contacted a therapist. I realized I wouldn't be able to get through a divorce and everything it entailed without professional help. I constantly felt down, paranoid, worthless, like I wasn't good enough since my own wife had sought validation from another man. The therapist kept asking me what I needed right now. I said I needed peace and quiet, but also clarity. To bring order to my chaos. I told the whole story, and though the therapist kept a professional demeanor, I could see in her eyes that she was moved by how systematically demeaning Jenny and Brian had been. I read through Jenny's text messages again after she found the evidence. They were a mix of apologies and excuses. It didn't mean anything, it just happened. I was lonely and needed validation. I didn't know what I was getting into. I've realized I only love you. Please, we can go to couples therapy and fix this. I felt such disgust. I knew she had more or less enjoyed the affair for 2 years. How could she claim it just happened? You don't accidentally cheat for 2 years. It's an active choice, an ongoing lie, day in and day out. Despite my determination not to talk to her, I gave in to one thing. I agreed to meet her face to face, but in a public cafe. I thought it would be less likely to escalate into a scene there, and I didn't want to put myself in a position where she could manipulate me at home in what was now her house. I brought a small voice recorder in my pocket to document the conversation. Perhaps it was overkill, but I'd learned my lesson. I didn't want to give room for any more lies or distortions. When I arrived at the cafe, she was already sitting there with red, swollen eyes. I could tell she had been crying a lot. She stood up to hug me, but I held up my hand, clearly signaling that I didn't want any physical contact. I saw her slump back into her chair, realizing the extent of my detachment. She immediately began apologizing and wanted to tell me how terrible she felt. I cut her off, saying I wasn't there to listen to her sobs, but to ask a few questions and get straight answers. Nothing more. I asked her directly, why did this happen? She talked about how she missed excitement and how her job as a flight attendant brought many opportunities for flirtation and adventure. She said it was never about love with Brian, only sexual attraction and experiencing something forbidden. I didn't want to hear the details, but I needed to hear her explanation outright. It was clear she didn't even fully grasp how disrespectful it was to me. Or maybe she did, but prioritized her own desires anyway. When I asked her, "Did you love him?" she shook her head and said, "No, absolutely not," with a serious tone. She claimed it was about lust, thrills, and adrenaline, and that she never intended to leave me for Brian. As I sat there, I thought that made it hurt even more. She had betrayed me repeatedly, with no intention of being with him. She just wanted both. She wanted the stable marriage with me and the forbidden affair with him. That's the definition of selfishness. I pressed her about how long it had been going on. She admitted it had been about 2 years. I asked why she didn't end it, if she ever planned to. I was going to end it soon, she said quietly. I didn't believe her for a second. Had they not been caught, it probably would have continued until I or Claire discovered it in some other way. She tried to say she was confused and didn't know how to get out of it, but I didn't buy that. She wasn't confused every time they met or every time they sent disparaging texts about me and Claire. I also wanted to know if there had been other men besides Brian. She adamantly insisted there hadn't, that he was the only one. I have no concrete evidence to the contrary, but honestly, I don't know what to believe anymore. When I confronted her about how she and Brian had spoken poorly of me, she became even more distraught and insisted it was mostly a joke between them, a way to egg each other on. She tried to excuse it by saying Brian also spoke poorly of Claire. It doesn't matter to me. They did it together, mocked us, and it hurts just the same. I asked why she had been so insistent on introducing Brian to me and why she invited him over so often. She admitted it was part of the thrill, part of the excitement. She enjoyed the feeling of hiding in plain sight and seeing that I remained oblivious. She truly got a kick out of having Brian close while I was in the same room, as if she was demonstrating her ability to deceive me right under my nose. She tried to excuse herself by saying she didn't understand how bad it was, but I could hear in her voice that it was something she found almost arousing. Eventually, I had to end the conversation for the sake of my own mental health. I told her I had already started the divorce process. She completely broke down, collapsing over the table and crying so loudly that everyone around us stared. I almost felt embarrassed for her, but at the same time, I had no sympathy left. I calmly stood up and walked away, leaving her in her own chaos. I felt the eyes of the other cafe patrons on me, but I couldn't care less. I was done. There was nothing more to say. Afterward, she continued to bombard me with calls and texts. She sent emails begging for forgiveness, saying we could go to therapy, that we could find our way back to each other, that she loved me. Mutual friends sometimes reached out, suggesting I should give her a chance to explain that she had made a mistake. But this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a long-term, calculated behavior. With each attempt at contact, I felt my resolve strengthen. I can't and won't forgive this. I also decided to contact Brian Moore's wife, Claire. I felt she deserved to know the truth. I sent her both pictures and excerpts from text conversations between Brian and Jenny. She responded briefly, "Thank you for telling me. I've suspected for a long time." Later, I heard she filed for divorce from Brian. They had been married for a few years, and she had been walking around with a gut feeling that he was cheating. She finally got confirmation. We've had some contact via text, mostly to coordinate our stories about what happened. We're both hurt and angry. But there's a strange comfort in knowing you're not alone in this nightmare. Now I'm sitting here writing all of this, mostly because it helps me think clearly. I'm living in a new, smaller apartment and have no plans to return to my old life. Jenny and I are in the middle of the divorce process. Brian and Claire are as well. I don't know what the future holds. Right now, I'm just trying to find my identity again, to understand where I went wrong and how I can move forward without being bitter for the rest of my life. Therapy helps, my friends help. And when I lay my head on the pillow at night, I try to tell myself that all this pain might be a step towards something better.
If you liked this story, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It helps a lot, and you won't miss out on any future stories. Take care and live your best life.